Not long after God had made Saul king of Israel, it wasn't too long before he started to go astray, go away from God and go away from his commands. And so God decided that he was going to put somebody else on the throne. He was going to put David on the throne. And make no mistake about it, not long after this, he started to hunt David down like a dog. I mean, he followed him everywhere. In fact, we know there 14 occasions where he tried to kill David, but as we know, he failed. And in contrast with that, David had two opportunities to kill Saul, but he deliberately chose not to do that. One time it was in a cave, another time was when Saul was in his camp, surrounded by his people. And so, when we contrast them together, I want to look at the first part when David was in a cave, because we find some interesting things happening here. After being told where David was, Saul managed to get 300 young men together to continue this hunt for David. And he goes there, and we're told he goes to a place called En-Gedi. Now, En-Gedi is basically a place where wild goats would run around, because it was a very rocky area, and some goats would jump up and down the cliff edges and things like that. That's where they basically lived. But also in there was a bunch of caves. Some caves were very small, and some caves were very big. And we find David, along with 600 of his men, in one of these caves. And so that's where we find them. But can you imagine what's going through the hearts and minds of David's men as they see Saul approaching with 3,000 men? Imagine what's going through their mind. I would imagine they'd be panicking. I would imagine they'd be thinking to themselves, this is it, it's the end of the road. You know, Saul is going to slaughter us along with David when he gets a hold of us. But as Saul gets closer and closer on his own, David's men sneak to the back of the cave. And as they're in the back of that cave, you know, this wasn't going to be the time to sneeze. This wasn't going to be the time to cough. This was going to be a time when they needed to be still and know that God is God. And so, little did they know that Saul was just going into the cave to use it like a bathroom. So, in more ways than one, Saul was the only one who wasn't the only one who was going to get some kind of relief. David's men were going to get relief that he was just coming in to relieve himself, not because he knew where they were. And so David appears to be totally oblivious to what his men are thinking. And so he sneaks up on Saul in stealth mode. And he goes up and he cuts a piece of his robe. But notice the text tells us that David was deeply troubled in his mind when he did this. But why was that? Why was he troubled? Well, remember that Saul was the Lord's anointed one. He was the Lord's anointed. And so if David, by cutting off a piece of his robe, he may have been signalling that he was against the Lord's anointed one, that he wanted Saul out the road so that he could become king. And this shows us how much respect David has, not only for God, but for Saul himself. David knows it was God who rose and brought Saul up, and he knows that God is going to remove Saul when the time is right. But when you look at the text, you can kind of sympathise with David's men here, can't you? Because remember, they too have been hunted down like dogs. And so, as far as they're concerned, as soon as Saul walks into that cave, that was a sign from God. It was a sign from God saying, here is your opportunity, kill him. And maybe they may whispered to David, David, just kill him. Just get rid of him. But as far as David is concerned, Saul was God's anointed. And so he wasn't going to do that. And so David's men, they too have been hunted down like dogs. And I would imagine them either talking to each other or whispering at least, to David and saying, just kill the guy. Be done with it. That way we won't have to run on the run and live on the run all the time like fugitives. But David thought differently. David knew it was better to live on the run like a fugitive than it was to be guilty of killing the Lord's anointed. Let me ask you this. What would you have done if you were David? What would you have done in that situation? Would you have killed Saul just to please the men around you, to get their respect? Or would you have done what David done? You see, David's lockdown come to an end, just like the lockdown we're in come to an end. And when his come to an end, he actually came out of the cave. He came out of the cave to greet Saul. And notice what happened here. You know, David could have killed him quite easily in that cave. And he quite easily could have killed him in the camp. But instead of killing him, he showed him kindness. He showed him compassion. And we too, when we face our enemies, when we come face to face with our enemies, must show kindness and compassion. The proverb says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. That's exactly what David did here with Saul. And so no wonder David is called a man after his own heart. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this: do you desire to be the man or woman after God's heart? Do you desire to do everything that the Lord commands you? I pray you do. Stay blessed, stay focused, and stay in Christ. God bless.